Of course.
Yeah, right at that second. It is Detective Steve Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, City of Mesa Police Department. We're here today to tell everyone about an incident we're asking about that happened on June 19th of this year at about 10:06 p.m. here in Mesa. The way we first found out about this was on June 20th when we received a call from Channel 12 here, local station. They had received a cell phone video of a passerby as two of our officers were taking a suspect into custody near Extension in Maine. Again, that was approximately 10 o'clock at night. So the 20th is when we first found out about that. We fulfilled that public records request, provided them the documents and information to that, and had not heard anything until just this weekend on Friday night. I believe approximately 10 o'clock newscast is when Channel 12 then ran that story. Moving forward from there and telling you about the incident itself. What I know at this point, what we know at this point, is on June 19th at approximately 10 o'clock near the intersection of Extension and Main in Mesa, two of our officers riding in a two-man patrol vehicle were on normal patrol when they observed an individual crossing Extension, from what I understand, against the don't walk signal. Did not have the hand signal or the light to walk. They saw that individual. They went down the street a short ways, made a U-turn, and came back to him to contact him. One of the reasons that they were doing that is, if you recall, last month in May, we had a huge push because of the number of pedestrian fatalities that we've had so far in this year. As of last month, we had already had 10 pedestrian fatalities for the year through the first 5 months, and that's normally what we would have for a whole year. So obviously it was very concerning to us. So one of the directives for officers working patrol is, when you have an opportunity, if you see someone who is crossing against the light or crossing the streets illegally in the roadway, is to stop those individuals and contact them. That's what these officers did. As I stated, they made that U-turn. They pulled along the curbway to stop them. The passenger officer stepped out of the vehicle and began to make contact with the person who was walking down the street. He points, and on the video that I will release to you guys, the Axon video, both officers were wearing Axon cameras, the on-body cameras. You can see that the officer is motioning to the individual to move to the side, an area where, assumingly, he was going to contact him. The suspect in this case does not move to that area, but makes a 180-degree turn of his body and begins to run away from the officer. Of course, the officer immediately gives chase, is able to catch him by a backpack that he's wearing, and they immediately begin to struggle and go to the ground at that point. By this time, the officer who was driving the vehicle has, of course, gotten the vehicle in park and is able to exit his vehicle, comes around and assists his partner in beginning to detain this suspect. Again, all three are on the ground at this point, struggling back and forth. Looking at the video, you can see that the suspect has his hands underneath his body. Obviously, that's typically something that we worry about in law enforcement, because we don't always know why someone has their hands under their body, if they're simply resisting, if they have contraband, if they have a weapon. We don't know at that point. As they're attempting to get his hands out from under his body and gain control of him, one officer loses his handcuffs that they're trying to use. The primary officer gets his Axon camera knocked off, and the struggle continues. During that point, the suspect's hand does come out from underneath his body, and when it does so, it comes out with a baggie of marijuana as we know it now. And that falls out onto the ground and begins to, he takes his hand, and if you see the video, you can see him, it's almost as though he's scrubbing it into the concrete, trying to disperse that marijuana there. Ultimately, the officers continue to struggle with him. They're still not gaining control. You can hear the commands, give us your hands, give us your hands, stop resisting, all of those things, not being effective. You see that there are some hand strikes by the officers given to the suspect. It looks like in his lower back area, best that I can tell, and that's also not effective. Again, at this point, it's just still a struggle, for lack of better terms. As the activity continues, well, one of the officers does then make some knee strikes to the suspect in his upper body, and I believe in his head or facial area. Once those knee strikes take place, they're able to gain control of his hands. You see them pull him behind his body. He's handcuffed, and that is the end of any physical altercation between our officers and the suspect. At that point, there's several other officers who are responding because they've heard the struggle on the radio. Obviously, they don't know what's going on. They just simply know that the officers are fighting with someone. They get everything slowed down a little bit. Everybody's maintained. Our suspect's in custody. Everybody starts to regroup themselves. Our suspect is showing some signs of minor injury. He has scrapes to his arms and elbows and looks like he has a bloody nose. One of our officers has a cut on his head as well. So Mesa Fire Medical does respond at that point, and they see everyone at that point. Both the suspect there on the street and the officers on the street determine that there's no injuries that require anyone to go to the hospital or transported. Once all of that is cleared up, the suspect and the officers then proceed to the jail for the booking process. Once they're down at the jail, unfortunately, they still can't get in right away because they are in the middle of our transport where the detainees who are here who need to go to county are going downtown, so the booking area is closed for those few moments in time. So the officers are conducting their interview in the Sallyport area, the area where we first come into the jail, ask basic medical questions and things like that before you're allowed inside. While sitting there, our suspect is, you know, he's been in a struggle just as our officers, so he's still sweating. He's still very hot. He makes a few complaints that he's dehydrated and that he's got sweat burning down in his eyes. Our officer, knowing he can't go inside, after talking to him a bit, says, hang on, goes inside, grabs some wipes, napkin type items, and comes back out and actually physically tries to clean up his face and clean the sweat out of his eyes. They do some basic questioning at that point while they're there. Our suspect says that the reason that he had tried to run is because he had marijuana and didn't want to get caught and go to jail. Simple as that. He's booked into jail, and that is the end of our contact with that point. At this point, we still have not been contacted directly by the suspect in this case, nor have we been contacted by the individual who filmed the cell phone video. So the only reason that we initially found out about this was because of that third-party contacts again through the media. So since that time, obviously we found out a lot of things we didn't know a few weeks ago. We have opened an internal affairs investigation into this so that we can look to see if policy and procedure was followed, if there was any inappropriate action by our officers, and we'll move forward from there. Because that just happened, I don't have a lot of answers that I can release to that. Obviously, you guys already understand with state law, there are certain things once an internal affairs investigation begins that we can't discuss anyway by law. But I think I've given you a pretty good overview of what we know today. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we still have to go through as we move forward, and we hope to get those things resolved. One of the things that we did do today to get this process moving forward even more, because of the nature of the allegations and the video that we saw, we invited in our community partners from our African American Forum to come in and sit down with the chiefs and our staff today to show them the video and let them see exactly what this is all about, because there's been such limited video and information that's been available so far. We've had a very strong relationship over the years with our community partners with regards to things like this, and when we have something like this happen, we don't try and run from it. We try and engage them and allow them to come in, view the video, make their own determinations, make suggestions. That's why we have the forums. That's why we have built those ties over the years, is so that when we have a problem, we can discuss it rather than having a bigger problem arise from lack of information and lack of accountability. I don't know what else I can tell you at this point. That's kind of where we stand.
The suspect this morning didn't quite give us a full narrative of from when he was first stopped, what was said, then taken to the ground. Can you, now that you've reviewed the video, can you tell us, you know, did the officers say stop, or did they say you're under arrest? or can you tell us what they said?
I can't tell you that exactly because, as you know, with Axon video, the first 30 seconds is in that buffer zone where you actually get the picture, but you don't get the sound. You can see the officer. He gets out of the car. He walks towards the suspect, and you can see him motion and point towards an area. There's a railing there because there's a car sales lot there, and it appears that he's motioning for him to have a seat there at the railing. That's when the suspect turns and runs. So I don't know the exact dialogue that went on between them. Obviously, since the internal has just begun, we haven't even had an opportunity to ask the officers yet what their exact wording was.
Steve, is this procedure, like if someone, for something as simple as small as jaywalking, for your officers to actually chase a guy down for not stopping as a jaywalker, is that what officers are supposed to do?
Well, again, this is not a jaywalking case, and I should mention the charges that he was charged with were possession of marijuana, possession of drug paraphernalia, resisting arrest, and obstructing government obstructions. Cases like this, let me answer the question. Cases like this, oftentimes we find people, for whatever reason, whether it be for jaywalking, as you want to call it, or whatever, and we go to make just a reasonable contact and get out to stop someone, and they take off running. We don't know who that person is. We don't know if they've been involved in another crime. We don't know if they just committed a homicide around the corner. I realize we're talking in extremes, but we don't know. And so simply when a person immediately turns and runs, when you get out and say hello, does it rise to a level of suspicion? Absolutely. In this case, you have a violation. You have a reasonable violation to stop them. In most cases, the people just stop and talk to us, and that's the end of the contact. There is no chase. There's no struggle on the ground. There's none of what you see.
But are they legally bound to do that? Aren't they legally bound to? They don't have to do that unless you say you're being detained.
Well, yes, they do have to stop. If the officer, in this case, he clearly motions for the individual to stop. Again, I can't give you the verbatim audio because I just don't have it. But he clearly, very clearly makes that motion for the individual to stop and have a stop in that location, at which point he turns and runs. You have a prior violation, albeit a civil traffic violation for crossing the street. At that point, he's not free to go until we, at minimum, identify him and tell him don't cross the street illegally against the hands. But we never got to that point because everything escalated from there.
So like Melissa said, when you first pulled him over, all you knew about was that he had jaywalked. So I think her question was, does that justify the force that they went after him with?
Again, the force that he went after him with had nothing to do with jaywalking. It had to do with the fact that you have an individual who's now running from a lawful detention. And that lawful detention is because of the violation that they just observed. Again, we have no idea who that individual is. I've been a police officer for 27 years. I've had individuals run. I don't know who they are. You catch them, you find them, and then you find out, as in this case, one of the things I didn't mention is he had a warrant for his arrest. You don't know why people run. They run for different reasons. Sometimes you have an individual that's scared. Sometimes you have an individual, in this case, as he stated, he had marijuana and didn't want to get caught with that. But you don't know. And when they run before you even have an opportunity to engage them in a conversation, it certainly makes it a difficult situation for everyone involved.
Was the use of force being investigated before inquiries, meaning is it procedure for Mesa Police Department to review instances where use of force is used? Was that already underway, or was that unknown until we inquired?
No. The full totality of the case wasn't being investigated because we didn't know a lot of these things. But anytime an officer uses force, from hand strikes to tasers, pepper spray, all of those things that we understand that are in the force continuum, a use of force report is required to be completed. And that goes through every use of force form that comes through is looked at.
And that would happen here?
That would happen here. Regardless of anything else, if we had never heard about this from the media or from this gentleman, a use of force form would have still been filled out because there was still a fight. He suffered injuries, our officer suffered injuries, so it still would have been reviewed absent any of this other information that came forward.
Do you know if that report was filled out?
I do know that it was filled out. There was a use of force form filled out that night, again, as is required. That's just standard procedure. The supervisor would fill that out.
How long does it take to get those reviewed?
You know, I don't have an exact timeline on how long it takes. Some of it depends on if we have obviously something that we know is egregious. It obviously may move to the front of the line, But you know, if they have several, then the use of force committee would convene at whatever date, and they would go through those use of force incidences. If we have things that we find out were tactically not sound or out of policy or otherwise, that's the whole reason for the use of force forum. That's the whole reason for the oversight, for the review, because if we're doing something wrong or we could do something better, there's a lot of times you could just simply say we could do something better. Absent of that review, we would never get to that point. So that's how we police ourselves.
Are the two officers still doing their normal duties, or were they put on any sort of...
The two officers in this case are still currently on patrol. Again, we didn't know about most of this until just recently. So what will happen now that an internal affairs investigation has been initiated, that will be reviewed, and then our command staff will make the determination whether or not they stay on patrol based on the allegations and what they see, or they are reassigned. But that's at an executive level, and it varies from case to case. There is no absolute for that. Any of us could pick out the worst of the worst crimes, and we know someone would get reassigned or suspended for. But for normal, I hate to say daily work of a police officer, which sometimes means engaging a suspect who might be fleeing in this case, a shoplifter, or any number of circumstances you can come up with, those officers are not always reassigned because it just doesn't rise to that level. I can't give you an answer yet on this one.
At this point, what is Mesa PD's official response to the allegations that were made this morning about police brutality and racial profiling?
Certainly they are allowed to have their opinion, just as we are. All we can do is look at the information and review it. If we look at it and we find that there was a lawful detention, and we find that the force used was necessary, then we will, of course, go that route. If our use of force committee and our executive staff, once they've had an opportunity to interview everybody, the officers, hopefully the suspect in this case, we would love to interview the bystander that took the video or anyone else that saw it. Once they have an opportunity to do that, if they find that there was wrongdoing, Mesa Police Department has a very long history of holding its officers accountable all the way up through and to termination, depending upon the circumstances. We've all seen that here in the Valley. So if we find that there's wrongdoing, you can assure that we will address that appropriately. But at this point, it's too early to say that. We've got to do the investigation and then move forward from there.
So you mentioned the investigation is just now starting, but it's not like nobody knew about it in regards to paperwork, because it was mentioned that night, correct?
Correct, but we had no allegations that we had used any excess brutality or otherwise. All the paperwork was completed, the reports were completed, the use of force were completed. But again, as we stand here today, we've still not received any formal complaints from anyone. So we didn't know, if you will, that we were dealing with someone who was claiming that we were excessive in our force with them. So now that we know that, now that we have that, we can investigate that.
And you mentioned that you had members of the community here today to talk. And what did you guys discuss? How do you feel about after that meeting?
You know, anytime you deal with a difficult situation like this, you know, emotions are high. These are not always Mesa situations. Sometimes they're countrywide situations that bleed over to here. And so we want everybody to have a voice. Again, that's the reason we have the robust forums and community meetings that we do. And so we come in, we show the information, and we allow people to voice their opinion, and hopefully voice it in a reasonable way that we can not sit there and argue with each other. Even sometimes we agree to disagree, but if we can come with reasonable solutions, the community feels like we're not, for lack of a better term, sweeping something under the rug, and we're going to investigate our own and look at that, and if we find wrongdoing, address it, and if we don't, explain to them why. Explanation and information goes a long way, and the beginning of that process today for us, or a part of that, was meeting with our community leaders and community members so that they had as much information as we could provide today, so that they know where we're going moving forward. Obviously, as things move forward and we reach those critical points where we can provide more information, we'll certainly continue to do that, not only to them but to the media and the public. It is what it is, and all we can do is investigate it as best we can, put out as much information as we can, and make everyone aware of the situation.
What should community members, feel like now with obviously the high excessive, possibly excessive police brutality, or whatever you want to call it? How would you like to let the community know that,
Well, I get what you're asking, and I think that's very important. And again, I go back to, we didn't just start today with being engaged with our community. We have a very, very long and good history of being engaged with our community. So I think what that does is it gives us, again, a baseline. We invite them in, the community leaders that are involved in this particular case. We give them the information, and they can take that back to the other people in the community. That, along with interviews like this and coming forward and being out front with it, it lets them know that, A, our job still is to protect the community, to keep them as safe as possible, to keep their lives safe, to keep their property safe, and to make Mesa a good place to live for everybody. But at the same time, they understand that we're doing the work to investigate, and we will provide them with the answers that we come up with.
What now, if you get detained or officers try to detain you, obviously they might be afraid something might happen to them.
They who?
The person getting detained.
Sure.
I mean, there might be a fear now that for whatever reason they might get attacked by police for whatever reason. What would you like?
Well, first, we don't attack people. If we have a reason, a lawful reason to stop and detain somebody, we will stop and detain them. You know, as far as fear, I don't think people who are out lawfully in the community have anything to fear. They shouldn't. They're out lawfully in the community going about their lives and their business. At the same time, if you're crossing a roadway, if you were committing a crime, if you're shoplifting, if you're stealing a car, if the police go to contact you and we tell you to stop for a lawful, legitimate reason, you don't have the right to run at that point, at least till we can investigate who you are, identify you, and move on from there. It may be a situation where you get nothing more than a warning, but we can't even get to that point if we have to chase you down the street. We've got to at least get the community to hopefully buy into the point where, you know, we're not out there to bother you, we're not out there to disrupt your day, but again, this all started, as someone wants to say, because of jaywalking. In the first 5 months of this year, we had more fatalities, pedestrian fatalities, than we typically have in a standard whole year. That was a big deal. We put out press releases. We produced a public service announcement. We were on Mesa Channel 11. We've talked to every news station in town trying to get people to understand that they've got to stay on the roadway because it's an important thing. And that's where we're at.
I think the thing that resonated with people, Steve, is they saw police punching a man, you know, and they saw 2-on-1.
Correct.
So can you talk about the continuum of force, or, you know, maybe if people aren't, you know, that's what they resonated with.
Sure.
Can you just talk about that?
And I understand that. And, you know, I watch TV like everyone else. I can tell you that anytime you have to have some sort of physical altercation, it's never going to look good. If it did, people wouldn't watch MMA and all these other things that are out there in the world. But when you go hands-on with someone, in this case, because you're trying to detain them, one of the things that seems like inevitably happens is everybody ends up on the ground. The officers end up on the ground, the suspect ends up on the ground, and one of the assumptions is just because officers are on top of someone, they may have gained control and they're on top of them, that doesn't mean that the detention is over. The detention is over once we get someone secured. And if that person is still actively resisting, not pulling their hands out from their body, not allowing the officers to handcuff and detain them, you can't let go. Because again, you go back to, unfortunately, the basics of police work is that you don't know what's underneath them. You don't know if it's drugs, you don't know if it's a weapon or otherwise. So at some point, everyone's going to start to get tired. And when you reach the point where the basic pulling and struggling with someone's arms is not being effective, that's when you move to strikes. In some cases nowadays, obviously, you see tasers, you see pepper spray, all of those things. None of that was really applicable here. We didn't tase this gentleman. We did not hit him with a baton. We did not pepper spray him. In the whole continuum of things, this was on the low end of force, albeit it looks quite violent on TV, and that's just the nature of what it is. But the only goal by our officers when you get into a situation like that is to control the suspect's hands, get them safely secured, and then all of that activity stops. And when you watch this video from the start of when the contact is through the scuffle and the final containment of him, the immediate response once he's detained is all of that activity stops. And medical treatment is immediately brought forward to be sure that he is okay. Everybody good?
Thank you.
Thank you.